Just sort of welcome everybody. You may have noticed that I am not Richard. Richard is otherwise engaged, I think, with some work commitments. So I am the substitute host. Um, I would just like to welcome you all to the first talk of 2026 for the Castle Studies Group monthly lectures. Um, and could I just remind people to please sort of be on mute? And also, because we are recording, if you'd like to turn off your cameras so you are not seen in person, please do. Um, what I'd like to do is in for the also just remind people we will sort of have questions, but if you can put questions in the chat throughout the talk, and then also we can then and all no, just put your hand up at the end when we start to doing questions. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce um, our speaker tonight, Dr. Nick Morton. Um, Nick has written, has been, I would have to say, quite a prolific author on the Crusades, having got his PhD back in 2008, and he has since been at, I think not well. You started had a little bit of a stint at Swansea University before ending up in Nottingham, Trent, and continuing the line of castle specialists at Nottingham institutions. I think we've got one with no such with Philip and Pamela. But his specialty has really been he's written a series of books. He particularly focuses on holy orders and the knights, and has written numerous books on that. But his most recent book was on called The Mongol Storm, which I've read and was an incredibly good read. And so looking forward to his latest book on the Crusades, and talk is going to be about the castles of the Crusades. So without further ado, Nick.
Thank you so much, and very nice to meet you all. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. Yes, I'm going to be speaking about the Crusader castles, and I've got a PowerPoint. Let's just see if I can make it work. Oh, you need to turn the sharing on.
Trying to you can share right. Yep, there we are. Done.
Excellent. So you should all see a rocky valley looking down towards the Dead Sea. Is that what you're all seeing?
Yes.
Good. So yes, hello, I'm Nicholas Morton and I work for Nottingham Trent University and I study the Crusades, Mongols, medieval Middle East and things like that. And I'm going to give you a survey into Crusader castles. Of course, when we speak and talk about castles, we're really talking about a very wide range of different types of fortifications. And I'm going to start off by talking about their military roles. Here we have a photograph of the castle at Jbeil, just to the north of Beirut, a very classic looking Crusader castle, a central keep with then four towers, and an enclosure around it. Very common type for Crusading castles. But I'm going to focus on their military role and how it changes over time first, because it gives me an excuse to provide you with a general overview for the history of the Crusades that I'm hoping will place it in context. So, as many of you will know, in 1095, Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade, which then set off in various waves to distant Jerusalem. Most of the waves were wiped out very quickly, but one of the largest, crossed Anatolia and laid siege to Antioch. And this is where the Crusaders began building their first siege castle, or their first castle. They laid siege to the northern Syrian, it's currently in southern Turkey, city of Antioch in a siege that lasted for 8 months, during which they fought off three relief armies, and during the siege they erected two siege castles outside the major gates of Antioch. So a siege castle is not a sort of classic castle. You'd never go to an English heritage site and look around a siege castle, or not typically. A siege castle, in its origins at least, is simply a pile of whatever rubble they can throw together to create some kind of fortification to maintain pressure on a besieged city. Often they're stationed outside the gates of that city to prevent the ingress and egress of the defenders or anyone trying to help them. And this is the first occasion when the Crusaders built any castles, but they built many more siege castles like that in later years. After the siege of Antioch, the Crusaders advanced south from Antioch down to Jerusalem, and they conquered Jerusalem in 1099 with an exceptionally brutal siege. So this is the First Crusade, and this is the establishment of a series of four territories. Well, three to begin with, one that came later, that are collectively known as the Crusader states. And they are the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that's the really big one in the south, the Principality of Antioch around Antioch, and the County of Edessa inland from there. And then in 1102, the one of the first Crusade commanders called Count Raymond of Toulouse laid siege to Tripoli and later conquered Tripoli, creating the County of Tripoli. So four mainland Crusader states. And in their early years, they expanded aggressively. And so what we're looking at in the wake of the First Crusade is castles being used in offensive warfare. I mean, typically we think of castles as being defensive structures, and of course the structures themselves are, but they do have a role in offensive warfare, and it goes something like this, that in their origins, all those territories created by the First Crusade were extraordinarily vulnerable, because after the conquest of Jerusalem, most of the Crusaders went home. And Jerusalem, Antioch, and Edessa, the earliest cities, were held by just a few hundred troops, surrounded by vastly more powerful neighboring authorities. So they need troops desperately. They need settlers, mercenaries, more crusaders, pilgrims, enough people to drive the project of the Crusader states forwards. And that means bringing people in by sea. So they focus their attention on the conquest of the major ports along the Levantine coast. And here too, they used siege castles to blockade these ports initially on their landward margins and to wear them down in preparation for their ultimate overthrow. Tyre is an example of one such city. Further south, Ascalon was surrounded by siege castles too, although that was taken somewhat later. So again, the use of siege castles in offensive warfare. But there are other ways in which to use castles aggressively, and that is in their early years, the Crusader states wanted to expand inland, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south wanted to push across the Jordan River into the Transjordan area around here. But how does it hold down that territory? How does it retain control, particularly given that we're talking about a time when the Crusader states have very few troops? Well, what they do is they learn a lesson from the Normans. And we've all heard of the Normans and their motte Bailey castles in England. They also conducted several major conquests only a few decades before the First Crusade in southern Italy and Sicily. And there they use castles quite distinctively. Plant a castle in the centre of the territory you want to conquer and use it as a base for operations. And then when your army can no longer conduct operations from that castle, the castle's garrison acts like a sort of piton in that territory, holding down control until further raids can be waged from it going forwards. And so in Transjordan, the Crusader states, or the Kingdom of Jerusalem, build two castles, one called Monreal and one called Kirak. And they're both to the southeast of the Dead Sea, which is here. And these castles aren't coincidental. It's not just territory for the sake of territory that the Crusaders are trying to hold. This is a major commercial route. Now, the Syrian desert extends to this sort of area here. And so anyone wanting to follow the Silk Roads, which begin in Central Asia and China, following through Persia and northern Syria, then round to Aleppo and Damascus, If they want to go from there to Egypt, they've got to go south of the Dead Sea and then into Egypt. In other words, directly below these two fortresses. So castles as tools of conquest are being planted at strategic locations where they can tax travelers, merchants, pilgrims, artisans on the move, anyone traveling on the roads. It's a way of controlling territory, but also of controlling key strategic points. And so again, castles are being used when there are very few troops available to the Crusader states. The castles compensate for them to some degree by allowing them to hold territory with only small garrisons but large fortifications. So let's take a look at one of these early castles. Now, what you're seeing, the bigger of the two images here, this is Kerak. It's in modern day Jordan. As you can see, it's enormous. The castle as it stands today is much bigger than it would have been. The original castle would have been just a fraction of the size. It's been substantially rebuilt by the Crusaders and then by the Ayyubids, that's Saladin's dynasty, and later on by the Mamluk Empire. But you can see from the way the castle's laid out what they're doing. This is very common. They use the landscape to maximum effect. The castle is built on a spur of land sticking out from the side of a valley. And so on three sides, it has very natural defences that slopes going down to the valley floor. And then on the fourth side, where the spur connects to the hillside, there's a large rock-cut trench, effectively making the castle an island even before they've then built up its fortifications. And there's lots of castles like this in the Middle East, using a valley spur and then cutting the connecting point with a trench. Another castle built in the early years of the Crusader states, but a bit much further north, is this castle in modern day Syria. You can see the change in landscape. It's far more lush several hundred miles to the north. And this is Seyon. It's now commonly known as Saladin's castle. And here it's exactly the same. The castle, you can only kind of see it here, but it sits on a steep-sided valley spur. And here, the rock-cut trench is considerable. I've included a photograph of it just below the bigger photograph, and you can see it's tens of meters deep. Very, very hard to take the castle. Effectively, it turns the castle into an island. So the castle builders of this era have a very shrewd eye for geographical detail and how to make good use of it. Okay, so the Crusader states expand and they continue to use castles for these kinds of purposes. Siege castles and castles for holding down territory. But in the bigger of the Crusader states, at least, castles aren't typically used for defensive purposes because, for the most part, they're on the attack. They use the town of Tiberias as their major sort of jumping off point for attacks towards Damascus, which is one of their major opponents, and Jaffa in the south as a major defensive point against Egypt. But they don't need lots of defensive castles because, for the most part, they're the ones doing the attacking. And the fortunes of war, they fluctuate across the 1130s, 40s, and 50s. But when a new dynasty takes over, called the Zangid dynasty in Syria and what would be today northern Iraq, resistance to the Crusaders builds considerably. And so in the 1160, the Crusaders, or Franks as they became known, they begin to start building large castles on their frontier. The idea being to substantially build up their defenses because now they're being attacked at least as much as they're being attacking themselves. And those castles fill the natural weak spots in their defenses. So the Crusader states actually have very good natural defenses because there is a line of high ground from roughly around Acre in the south, running parallel to the coast but not against it, all the way up to, well, just south of Antioch in the north. And though that ridge of high ground can be very substantial, it rises to its peaks in the Lebanese mountains, which of course are impassable to armies. So what the castles have to do for defensive purposes is to plug the gaps. So armies can attack the Crusader states by going south of the mountains, but north of the Sea of Galilee through here. That's one hole. And another is called the Homs Gap, which is the only really big hole gap in the mountain chain around here. And so they start plugging these gaps. In the south, the Knights Hospitaller, they built a castle called Belvoir, which is to block the frontier in the north. In fact, it's just to the south of Lake Tiberias. And before I explain Belvoir, just a little bit of detail on the Knights Hospitaller. So you've probably heard of them, Knights Hospitaller, Knights Templar, those kinds of things. Well, these are some of the more unique expressions of the crusading movement. The Knights Hospitaller began as a purely medical institution in Jerusalem before the First Crusade, when it was under the control of the Egyptian Fatimid Empire. And then when the First Crusade occurred, and the hospital in Jerusalem grew considerably, acquiring lands in Western Europe and elsewhere. Now, the Knights Hospitaller, like many other institutions that had wealth in the newly founded Crusader states, they found themselves under increasing pressure to use some of their money for military purposes. And so by the 1120s, there are the first indicators of the Knights Hospitaller using their money to defend castles or put together mercenary troops. By the time we get to the 1150s, the Hospitallers have large formations of troops in addition to their medical facilities. The Knights Templar are similar. They began as a group of pilgrim escorts in the wake of the First Crusade, but later they grew in role, acquired substantial landholdings in Western Europe, and began to garrison castles and deploy troops in their own right. And many of the castles built or defended in the Crusader states were built by either the Templars or the Hospitallers, or at least garrisoned by them. So there's a change in tides. The Crusader states are now being attacked as much as they are attacking, and so they build new castles. And what you're looking at here, it's not a very large castle, but it has its place in the history of castle design. And this is Belvoir. Now, what makes Belvoir interesting is that it is exceptionally well equipped to defeat the siegecraft of an attacking army. Now, I'm going to go into this siegecraft in a bit more detail in a few minutes, but for the sake of argument, siege tactics of this era, whether conducted by Turkish armies or Kurdish armies, or Saladin's dynasty, they're from a Kurdish background, they depend on a massive archery barrage followed by undermining. And what the Hospitallers are doing at Belvoir is to specifically design a castle to defeat those precise tactics. We don't necessarily think about castles these days as being specific technological solutions to a problem. It's very common to think of them as just, well, stone walls, people lived in them, people defended them. It's only very rarely you come across people talking about them as being specifically crafted to answer a specific military problem. Well, their attackers depend on archery. And so the Hospitallers built two sets of concentric walls, one behind the other, so they can have two lines of archers or crossbowmen defending their walls, maximizing their defensive barrage. That's one factor. At the wall's foot, now you can see the castle's been substantially destroyed, all its upper walls are gone, but you can just make out that its lower walls into the dry moat have a short glacis to them. That's to widen the base to make it harder to undermine them. Belvoir also has an astonishing, now I'm hoping I'm going to get this right, but I think it's 26 sally ports. The point being that the defenders can conduct a very active defense. Anyone trying to conduct mining operations at their wall's base is going to find themselves under repeated attack from multiple different sally ports every night. So it's a very hard castle to attack, and in fact it took Saladin well over a year to get into the castle, despite the fact that he tried very hard to do so in later years. So the castle is a specifically designed technological solution to the known preferred siege tactics of their opponents. It's also one of the first, if not the first, concentric castle built by a Western European builder anywhere. It's thought that perhaps the inspiration for having two concentric lines of walls may have come from the walls of Theodosius of Constantinople, although it's equally possible that there are concentric walls further north in some of the old classical cities in northern Syria that may also have inspired that choice. Okay, so the attacks on the Crusader states intensify, and they intensify even more under Saladin, who establishes his own empire in the 1170s and 1180s. He takes control in Egypt in the name of his master Nur al-Din initially, and then conquers Nur al-Din's territories in Syria in the 1170s and 1180s, until by 1187, Saladin is able to apply sufficient pressure to the Kingdom of Jerusalem to defeat their major field army at the Battle of Hattin in July 1187, and a few months later, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem following a shortish siege, and naturally this marked a key turning point in the history of the Crusader states. Saladin also marched north and caused substantial destruction to the northern Crusader states as well, and all of this destruction then paved the way and provoked the Third Crusade, led by people like Frederick I of Germany, Philip II of France, and perhaps most famously, Richard I of England. Now, after the Third Crusade, the Crusader states limp on in a much reduced form. They never regain the strength they had before Saladin's conquests in 1187, but they limp on for almost a century. And the reason they do this is because Saladin's heirs fight amongst themselves. And they do that for almost 70 years. And that creates a window of opportunity for the Crusader states to survive, in some cases even to thrive, or to regain some of their lost territories. And in this same century, the Mongols arrive in the Middle East, and the Mongols also serve to distract everyone's attention, which allows the Crusader states to survive. And it's in this second century, really, of the Crusader states that you get, so I shall come back to that, some of the really big castles constructed by the Crusaders. Now, you may remember me mentioning that the places that the Franks Crusaders build their castles are in geographical weak spots. And one of those geographical weak spots is called the Homs Gap. It's in Syria, but near the Lebanese border. And it's in the Homs Gap the Knights Hospitaller, again, built one of the most famous Crusader castles, which is Crac de Chevalier, which you can see here. Absolutely enormous. Again, notice it's got two lines of concentric walls, loads of arrow slits. It's got a glacis on its inner ramparts. Again, this is a castle designed to resist Turkish and Ayyubid siege tactics. It's also huge, and that warrants attention. The reason the castle's so huge, as has been argued very cogently by a historian called Ronnie Ellenblum, is precisely because the Crusader states were so weak. Big castles can be a sign of weakness, because what you're basically saying, excuse me, is if you build small castles, that's showing that essentially you expect to be able to relieve that castle fairly quickly. It only has to hold out for a few weeks, and then the relief army arrives. But in the 13th century, with the Crusader states much reduced, they don't have that luxury. In many cases, castles have to survive without being relieved at all. And so they'd better be big. So Crac de Chevalier is thought to have had a garrison of over 1,000 troops, which is enormous. And that it may have got a lot bigger in time of war. That could well be just its peacetime garrison. The Knights Templar have another massive castle further south at a place called Safad. But these castles are designed to hold out even when the Crusader states are under attack and without much hope of relief, at least not in the short term. So they've got to hold out for a long time. And all sorts of innovations went into their design. Castles this size have swimming pool sized cisterns deep in their bowels, rainwater collection system because there's not much water and the springs tend to dry out in the summer. And of course, the latest military design techniques in architectural terms as well. During the same century, in the 13th century, visiting Crusaders also built castles, and a famous example of those is Sidon in modern-day southern Lebanon. And as you can see, it's built in the shallow water just off the coast, or just off the Lebanese coast. And here too, you can see a very sensible way to address the dangers of undermining. You can't undermine a castle that's surrounded on all sides by the sea, obviously. And so there too, it's hard to approach, it's hard to bombard a castle like that, whether with archers, crossbowmen, or catapults, and it's immune to undermining. So it's another solution, but in this case, again, using the geography. And there are several castles like this built in shallow water, specifically so that they can't be attacked via undermining. Even so, these castles often fell fairly swiftly. Crac de Chevalier fell in only a few weeks, when ultimately it was attacked in 1271 by the Mamluk Empire. And part of the reason for this is that by this stage, the Crusader states are in such a weakened state. They've run out of food, there's no hope of supply, there's no hope of relief anytime soon, and eventually the Crusaders, I suspect because they ran out of food, were forced to surrender, and they couldn't bring their crops to harvest in their neighbouring farmlands, so they couldn't replenish their stocks, and so they were eventually worn down until the Crusader states, well, Crac de Chevalier fell in 1271. The last of the mainland Crusader states castles fell 20 years later in 1291 with the fall of the port of Acre. Okay, I hope you held on to your hats. That's my whistle-stop tour of castles and their military functions during the Crusades. And I hope I've given you at least a basic framework for the history of the Crusader states as well. Let's look a little bit closer at siege techniques. Now, I've already mentioned that the main weapons used against Crusader castles were a massive artillery and archery barrage, followed by undermining. The undermining brings down the outer walls, in go the assault troops. And the great strength of that process is it can be really quick. You can get inside a castle. We know that Saladin's forces, for example, got inside the town of Tiberias in a single night. Other castles took longer, but with that kind of approach, it can be very efficient at bringing castles down quickly. The problem with that approach is it is exceptionally costly in terms of casualties, because what you're doing is lining up tens of thousands of archers outside a castle's walls, and naturally they're being mown down by the defenders shooting through lines of arrow slits. There are whole shooting galleries in Crusader castles. There are catapults on or behind the walls. So there's a big defensive barrage going on. And so the death toll among the attackers before they've reached suppression point, where their artillery and archery barrage has basically stopped the defenders offering an active resistance, those casualties would be enormous, but they're in a better position to absorb those casualties than, say, the Franks would be, who always have insufficient numbers. Now, another castle to fall in the same year as Crac de Chevalier was a castle controlled by another military order, less well known, called the Teutonic Knights, who are famous for their wars in the Baltic, but they also had castles in the Crusader states. And what's interesting about one of their castles, called Montfort, in the hills of Galilee, is that the mine is still there. It was never completed. So what you're looking at in the photograph on the right here is the mine built by the Mamluk Empire in 1271, intending to undermine the castle, but because the castle was built on very secure bedrock, it didn't actually work. So it's one of the very few examples from the medieval era of an actual medieval mine that's still there. So uh, that's one sort of classic piece of evidence to give you, therefore, undermining techniques. Another interesting aspect of crusading siege warfare is that it's in this era that the counterweight trebuchet is devised and deployed. And the trebuchet has an interesting history. Now, trebuchets initially were devised, it seems, in China, but the early models, what you would do is to get a team of engineers with ropes, and they would pull down the throwing arm, which would then lever over the fulcrum and throw up the other end of the throwing arm to release the projectile. But the downward pressure to cause that lever motion would come from tens of engineers pulling on ropes. It's not especially effective, and of course, it requires a lot of personnel to operate. But it was during the wars between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem that a new form of catapult was created, and that is the counterweight trebuchet, where the action created by the engineers pulling on ropes is replaced by a massive counterweight. And you can see counterweight here in this picture of the Mongols besieging a city. And what's interesting is that both Saladin's armies and the Kingdom of Jerusalem's armies started deploying this catapult at the same time, or very close. Now, historians have exhausted lots of ink trying to argue about which civilization was more innovative, which society invented more things than the other. But I've always found that kind of debate really rather unhelpful for the simple reason that most siege engineers, like most artisans in this era, are very hireable. They'll be very happy to fight for Saladin one day and then be hired by the Kingdom of Jerusalem on the other. And with siege engineers passing to and fro between opposing armies, there's nothing stopping them at all, taking new ideas with them. So we'll never know who invented the counterweight trebuchet, but we do learn something about the sort of artisanal milieu of this era, with different artisans and siege engineers passing across different frontiers of war and therefore exchanging technologies, which basically means the technological sort of balance between, say, Saladin's empire and the Crusader states is basically flat because they both have access to the same engineers. But the history of the counterweight trebuchet has an interesting ending, which is that when the Mongols began their conquests into China, and when they began to attack Song dynasty China in the southeast of China, they wanted better catapults. So as a result, they contacted their commanders in the Middle East, who then dispatched to them Muslim siege engineers who could construct counterweight trebuchets. And so the history of the trebuchet does a full circle, begins in China, reaches the Mediterranean, redevised as a counterweight trebuchet, and back it comes to China again. It's just one of the many sort of innovation developments of this era. So that's castles in a military sense, but let's talk about them a little bit now in terms of their other functions. Because as you can well imagine, the Crusader states are, for much of their history, just about anywhere in the Crusader states is liable to be raided. They have been referred to in the past as the land of perpetual war, and there are campaigns fought on at least one of the Crusader states more years, well, almost every year. In fact, there were so few years in which wars were not fought, as it were, that on the rare occasion that a year passed and no one fought anyone, people thought that was worthy of note in the histories of this era. It hardly ever happens. So there's fighting, there's raiding all the time. And the Crusaders, the Franks, their main opponents are Turkish light cavalry who move very quickly and can raid deeply into enemy territory or into Crusader territory. So that means that many places in the Crusader states have to be fortified. Now, we can have an argument about whether they count as castles or not, but we have examples of fortified churches, fortified monasteries, naturally fortified towns and cities as well. But we also have examples of fortified mills and fortified rural infrastructure. I might equally add that with Crac de Chevalier here, one of the towers in Crac de Chevalier has the footings for a windmill. Because why build expensive agricultural machinery where it will simply be burnt? Much better to build it in a castle where it can be protected. So castles serve a variety of functions, or fortified buildings serve a variety of functions in an area where there's a great deal of banditry, a great deal of raiding, and a great deal of incursions by, for example, neighboring Bedouin groups, among others. So what we're looking at here, this is an estate centre. Again, for some reason, I picked a lot of hospitaller examples today. Um, this is a fortified estate centre at a place called Aquabella. It's just off the road connecting Jerusalem to Jaffa, Jaffa being modern day Tel Aviv, or or right next to it. And unlike most sort of front line castles, Aquabella didn't need to be fully equipped to resist a siege with siege weapons and catapults and things like that. But it still required some fortification to fend off raiders. So what you're looking at here is not exactly a castle, but more a fortified estate centre, so that the estate's workers, their infrastructure, and potentially even their animals could be herded into Aquibella's estate centre in the case of a raid, and then protected until the raiders went away or were defeated or something like that. So this is quite common. You have lots of, in fact, the vast majority of castles or castellated buildings in the Crusader states are not big frontline castles of the kind I've already shown you. They're much smaller ones, often just a single tower or a single tower surrounded by four sort of surrounding towers with a curtain wall. And their purpose is just to protect an estate and to act as its center point in case there should be enemy raids. So there are a variety of functions. Castles naturally also serve as a sort of symbol of conquest. The Crusaders conquered much of this region, and they wanted to hold it down. And building castles was a way of emphasizing this is where we have arrived, and we are going to stay. And that was a way of sort of announcing that. So there is a sort of identity and ideological dimension to these castles as well. One question that's very natural to ask, whether it's about small castles like Aquabella or about really big ones like Crac de Chevalier, is how did they afford all these castles? Because I was taking a look at Crac de Chevalier. There are very few castles that big in Western Europe. How can they afford something that size? And there's a variety of answers to that. But the main point is, yes, they are enormously expensive. We're talking billions in modern day money. And so who's got that? The reason they can afford to build on this scale is in part because the Knights Hospitaller have something approaching 1,000 estates in Western Europe. And those estates are required to send one third of their income to the Crusader states every year in a process called responsions. And the cumulative wealth from that was enormous. And for many of you, if you live in the British Isles, or perhaps if you in France or Germany, you may well know of places near you which were former hospitaller preceptories or commanderies, which are the estates that they had in various parts of Western Europe. They provide the financial backbone that keeps the order supplied. But another factor that feeds into this is that the Crusader states, as I mentioned already, they sit on the western extension of the Silk Roads. Whether the Silk Roads go from Damascus south through the Sinai into Egypt, or straight from Damascus and Aleppo to the ports of the Levantine coast. There's a lot of money going in along those roads, and that can be taxed. So often those taxes will then play their part in paying for these massive Crusader castles. Let's now look at the castle building themselves, the castle buildings themselves, because, well, let's put it this way. When the Crusaders, the Franks, or indeed the Fatimid, Turkish, or Ayyubid enemies they fought, they all build castles, they all fortify various sites. And of course, the Middle East has been built over before. There are layer after layer of ancient civilizations across the entire Middle East, whether that is the buildings constructed in the previous centuries under Islamic rule, or by the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire, or before that, maybe the Greeks, or before that, maybe sort of going all the way back into the Iron Age or Bronze Age. People build stuff in the Middle East. And the local limestone and sandstone is pretty good for buildings. There's plenty of it. And here's my point. There's plenty of buildings still there when the Franks arrive. All those Roman theatres and amphitheatres and stadiums and towns and things like that. And so it's quite common, both for the Crusaders and for their Muslim opponents, to say to themselves quite reasonably, why bother creating new Lego bricks if there's already a huge stack of Lego bricks nearby? And so you can see in many cases, forts and fortresses are actually classical buildings repurposed to become fortresses. So let me introduce you to Bosra, to the southeast of Damascus. And the photograph in the top left, you can see Bosra looks like a pretty formidable fortress, and it was. It's also a Roman theatre, and you can see the interior here, which is quite literally a classical building repurposed to become a castle. In this case, it was constructed by Saladin's dynasty, I think these walls in the 1220s. Another example would be Baalbek in Lebanon. Here you can see it. Here you can see the Temple of Baal. This too, the old fortress, the old temple complex was repurposed to become essentially a fortified town, but they're using the blocks from the classical period, augmented with those that they created themselves. So there is a repurposing of classical era masonry so as to serve the architectural needs of the crusading era. Let's take another example. Let's take a couple of Crusader castles. Well, you have the same process taking place in Jebel here. And so this is a section of the walls in Jebel, and you can see this patterning here. It's been taken from a classical site. Yes, it's been repurposed and turned into a rectangular block or ashlar for the walls, but they're using classical building materials to make the castle. And if I go back to, here we go, to Sidun. Now, this isn't great because it's quite small, but you might be able to see that the castle walls have little circular dots on them. Those circular dots are literally classical era pillars, laid on their side and used as building materials, and why not? So this is really quite common. And in fact, you actually have accounts of Crusaders or Franks building castles using classical sites. And essentially they're conducting sort of rudimentary archaeology. They sometimes unearth ancient coins and things like that from the various sites that they have built, that they have deconstructed. But let's look at the castles and think about them not so much from sort of the materials they've used, but their actual design. Where are these designs coming from? Who's come up with them? And I think for me, this is the most fascinating aspect in the history of Crusader castles, which is that the designs for these sorts of castles come from everywhere and nowhere. They are an assortment of different designs from different cultures. Crac de Chevalier, it's a concentric castle. Very good chance that that concept, that its concentricness is based on the classical cities in the Middle East, possibly the walls of Theodosius in Byzantium, rather like Belvoir that I mentioned previously. It also has several very specific features that speak of Armenian Christian architecture. So it's borrowing on from other Eastern Christian influences. You can also see just about along this lower line of wall that there are some projections from the wall. They're called box machicolations. It's where the wall, you have a projection from the wall, and so you can drop things down to the wall's foot. Well, those box machicolations, they're very recent. They've only been invented a few, well, those particular types only a few years before crack was created, but they were first used in Islamic architecture. So there is an Islamic influence in Crac de Chevalier's construction. Now, Crac de Chevalier is also a monastery because it's a castle controlled by the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Hospitaller are professed religious. In other words, they're a bit like a monk and they've taken religious vows. So the interior layout of the castle is like that of a monastery, and it has all the various buildings and rooms that you would associate with the layout of a monastery. So these castles are an assortment of different architectural needs and influences. I should also mention the classical influences too, which naturally play their part in shaping what's going on here. And I can point out as well that the castles built by the Crusaders are, in this sense, very similar to those built by many neighboring civilizations, whether they are Eastern Christian or Muslim. Many of them show the influence of different architectural techniques all merging and being used at the same time. And that requires a little bit of explanation. And the way I explain it goes something like this. That yes, the Knights Hospitaller are very wealthy, they can afford to build a castle like this. But once it's built, they can't permanently retain a workforce on that scale. So you build Crac de Chevalier, maybe it takes you 3 or 4 years. Then the workforce has to go. They can't afford to pay them permanently, have them as a permanent staff. So the workforce have to go somewhere else. So where do they go? Well, if a mosque needs building in Damascus, they may well go there. If a palace is needed in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, they may go there. If a port is needed in the Kingdom of Cilician Armenia, they may go there. My point is that no one in the Middle East is wealthy enough to retain a permanent workforce all the time. So workforces are mobile. They travel from area to area following the work. And of course, rather as I explained with the catapults, they share their ideas. And this is why you have different architectural features appearing in the buildings constructed by various different cultures from this time. And we can even prove this in the actual blocks themselves. Because the way you build a castle like Crac de Chevalier is you may well say to the workers who are building this castle, okay, we're going to start work for the day today. So off you go, start building the various blocks we've commissioned. But what we want to know is how many blocks you personally have created so that we can pay you, because you're paid per block. Well, that makes sense. So as a result, the various stonemasons who make these blocks, they have to create a way to show their supervisor which blocks they've created. So what they do is they put a mark or a mason's mark on the blocks, and those mason's marks are unique to that particular mason. So the overseer can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and here's your money for the day, the week, the month, whatever term it's over. But there's the point. We have these masons' marks which show which blocks have been built by which masons. And some of those masons' marks are just their particular symbol, but we have others that are distinctively from the Greek or Arabic alphabet, which go to show that the workforce is multicultural. And that's why all these techniques are being merged and shared, which I've always thought is one of the most fascinating dimensions to the history of the Crusader castles. One other question when it comes to influences. Now, I'm flagging up here an area that needs greater research, but it's an interesting question. And that is, to what extent and how much did these castles in Syria or Lebanon or other parts of the Middle East, to what extent did they influence castle building in Western Europe? And that's a question that many historians have tried to have at least made a start in trying to answer. People have noticed, for example, again, the walls of Theodosius in Constantinople. You could potentially draw parallels between that and the castle built by Edward I at Carnarvon in northern Wales, perhaps. There are aspects of Caerphilly further south in Wales, which may potentially bear some resemblance to some of the castle developments taking place in the Middle East. Certainly, the counterweight trebuchets went back to Western Europe, but this is a topic that really requires opening up and a thorough study. To what extent and in what ways is there a cross-pollination of ideas in castle building between Western Europe and the Middle East, and between West and Middle East and Western Europe? One type of castle that you never seem to get in the Middle East is wooden Morton Bailey castles. And the reason for this is almost certainly very simple. There's just not enough wood for Morton Bailey castles because it's not a particularly forested area, particularly as you travel further south. The only wooden castle that I know of that the Crusaders built is high up in the Lebanese mountains. It's called the Cave of Tyron. It's a fortified cave which sort of clings to the side of a cliff. And that seems to have been built with cedar wood because it's right next to the cedars of Lebanon. But of course, that's not a facility open to everyone in this era and at this time. So this is the history of the Crusader castles, and they represent some of the most incredible and impressive expressions of military architecture, both the castles built by the Crusaders, but also neighboring powers, whether that's Saladin's dynasty or the Armenians. These castles represent some of the most impressive examples of pre-gunpowder architecture, although, of course, gunpowder is going to arrive soon, and here too, the Middle East plays its role. It's thought that gunpowder, which was originally devised in China, probably reached the Mediterranean in the mid 13th century. Certainly, the earliest gunpowder recipes we have in Western Europe are from that period, and the earliest by someone called Roger Bacon. He is someone with connections to the Mongols. So it seems as though the Mongols brought gunpowder technology west, and in the early 14th century, it's picked up both by various Islamic societies, but also by Western Europe as well. And needless to say, this is going to revolutionize castle design in later centuries. But that lies beyond the scope of this particular presentation. So if I can now just leave you with a slight commercial, if you don't mind. Here are some of my books and some of my social media contacts. Perhaps my best known book is probably Mongol Storm, which was introduced at the beginning. This has been reviewed in places like the Sunday Times and the LA Review of Books and places like that. It's a history of the 13th century Middle East, but told from 10 different cultural perspectives. I have a book called The Medieval Military Orders, which is a history of the military orders, including the Templars and Hospitallers. A book called The Field of Blood, which is a history of the early Crusader states. And in June, so in just a couple of months' time, I have my new book, Crusader Storm, which is coming out. And this is a history of the 12th century Middle East, again told from about 10 different cultural perspectives. It's available for pre-order. I hope you don't mind the quick commercial there, but I am very happy to take your questions, and this brings me to the end of my presentation.